Tonight we revisit one case that the century since has been unable to file away as concluded. It is preserved in trial transcripts, in Home Office papers, and in a body of private letters entered as evidence, and it has been examined and re-examined across 100 years without ever losing its hold on the record. One marriage, one bundle of correspondence, one execution that entered the national record and has remained there. The case of Edith Thompson begins in the eastern suburbs of London in the years following the First World War. To understand what happened and why the words that survive it were read the way they were read, it is necessary first to understand the ground on which those words were written, because that ground was itself a particular kind of place, made by a particular movement of people, at a particular moment in the growth of the city. The district in question lay along the frontier, where the county of London gave way to the county of Essex, in that broad belt of streets that the railways had called into being over the previous half-century, and that the census takers of the early 1920s recorded as one of the fastest expanding residential areas in the country. Manor Park, where Edith Graydon passed her childhood, and Ilford, where she would keep house as a married woman, were not old towns with a settled character of their own. They were suburbs in the literal and original sense of the word, built outward from the metropolis to house the clerks, the bookkeepers, the shipping agents, the commercial travellers, and the shop managers who worked in the city and along the docks, and who required, at the end of each day, somewhere respectable to return to that was neither the crowded inner parishes nor the country beyond. The instrument that made these districts possible was the railway. The Great Eastern Line ran its trains into Liverpool Street. The London, Tilbury and Southend Line carried its passengers into Fenchurch Street. And along both routes, station by station, the fields of Essex had been surveyed, sold, and laid out in the regular grids of terraced and semi-detached houses that the surviving photographs and the surviving street plans both record. A man could take a season ticket, board a train in the grey light of the morning, be at his desk in the city by 9, and be home again by 7, to a house with a small garden at the front and a smaller yard at the back, a house that was rented rather than owned in most cases, and that was distinguished from its neighbours by the net curtains in the window and the polish on the step, rather than by anything the builder had done to it. This was the physical fabric of the world in which the case unfolded, and it matters, because the respectability of that world, its keen attention to appearances, its horror of scandal, its measurement of a person by the tidiness of their front room, is not incidental to what followed. It is part of the evidence. The streets themselves ran to a pattern. In Ilford, the roads were named for a genteel England that most of their inhabitants had never seen. Kensington Gardens, Belgrave Road, De Vere Gardens, Ensley Gardens, borrowed titles that lent a suburban terrace the flavour, if not the substance, of the fashionable quarters after which they were named. The houses along them were solid without being large, of yellow-grey London brick, with bay windows and tiled paths and iron railings, occupied by families who kept perhaps a single servant or a daily help, who read the popular press, who took an annual holiday at the seaside, and who understood with great precision the fine gradations of standing that separated one clerkly household from the next. The population of Ilford had multiplied several times over in the space of a generation, and the character of the district was set by that newness, by the sense, shared by nearly everyone in it, of having arrived at a respectability that was recent, that had been worked for, and that could be lost. It was a world of routines. The morning train, the office, the evening train, the Sunday walk, the theatre in town on a special occasion, reached by the same railway that carried the men to work, the West End, lying at the far end of the line like a lit window. And it is on one such routine that the whole matter would eventually turn. a couple walking home from a station late at night along a suburban road they had walked 100 times before, between the station and their own front door. Edith Jessie Graydon was born on the 25th of December, 1893, at 97 Norfolk Road in Dalston, a street since renamed, and she was the eldest of the 5 children of William Eustace Graydon and his wife Ethel Jessie. The record here is unusually firm, because the Graydons were exactly the sort of family whose passage through life was documented. A birth registered, a baptism recorded, a household enumerated in the census returns that survive and can be consulted. William Graydon was a clerk, employed for much of his working life by the Imperial Tobacco Company. Ethel Graydon was the daughter of a police constable. They were, in the vocabulary of the period, respectable lower-middle-class people, neither poor nor comfortable, keeping their position by effort and by care, and they raised their children in the eastern suburbs the account has already described, latterly at Manor Park. Of Edith Graydon's childhood, the surviving record establishes more than it does for most young women of her class and time, and it establishes it consistently: that she was quick, that she was clever with figures, that she was fond of dancing and of the theatre, and that she carried herself with a liveliness and a confidence that those who knew her remembered long afterward. She left school in 1909 at the age of 15 and went into employment, as girls of her background did, in the clothing trade, first with a firm near Aldgate, and in time with a wholesale milliners in the city by the name of Carlton and Pryor. What is worth pausing over, because it will matter later, is what she made of that employment. She did not remain a junior. She rose. By the time of the events with which this account is concerned, she held a position of real responsibility in the firm, as a manageress and bookkeeper, trusted with the accounts and with the buying, travelling occasionally on the firm's business, and earning a wage that was, by the standards of the day and of her sex, a substantial one, in some periods, on the evidence that survives, a wage larger than that of the man she married. She married Percy Thompson in January of 1916. He was a shipping clerk, a few years her senior, steady, careful with money, a man of the same suburban world and the same clerkly respectability as her own family. They had no children. They set up house in Ilford at 41 Kensington Gardens, a street in the Essex suburbs, it should be said clearly, and not the London park of the same name. And to their neighbours, and to the passing eye, they were exactly what such a couple was expected to be: a clerk and his wife, both in employment, keeping a decent house on a decent road, the very image of the arrangement the whole district had been built to contain. How Edith Thompson is known to history is itself part of the case, and the manner of that knowing must be understood before anything else is said, because it is unusual and because it shaped everything. Most people of her station leave behind only the bare official traces, the registrations, the enumerations, the electoral rolls. Edith Thompson left behind, in addition, a very large body of her own writing. Over the course of the years in question, she wrote letters, many of them long and frequent and intimate, to a man who kept them, and it is through those letters, more than through any witness or any photograph, that her inner life entered the record. And it did so when it did, under the worst possible conditions, read aloud in a criminal court, selected and arranged by a prosecutor, and interpreted before a jury by men who had already formed a view of the woman who wrote them. Any account of who she was must therefore carry a caution that the surviving record itself demands. What we have of her mind is real, but it reaches us filtered, edited, and put to a use its author never intended. It is her voice, but it is her voice as evidence. The man to whom she wrote those letters, and who kept them, had come into her life some years after her marriage. He was younger than she was by the better part of a decade. He was a friend of her family before he was anything to her, known to her younger brothers, a visitor at the Graydon house. and in the summer of 1921, the two households, the Thompsons and the young man, went on holiday together to the Isle of Wight, and it is from that holiday that the surviving record dates the beginning of what followed. She was, at that point, a married woman of 27, in a marriage the record describes in ordinary terms and in some passages in unhappier ones. He was 19. The connection was made. What it would become was not yet written, and the account will not run ahead of the evidence to say that it was. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Now, back to the record. Frederick Edward Francis Bywaters was born on the 27th of June, 1902, in London. He was, at the time of the events described here, a very young man, an important fact, and one the account will return to, because much of what was later made of the case depended on the difference in years between him and the woman he loved, and on the assumptions that difference invited. By occupation he was a seaman, though not of the rough kind the word might suggest. He was a ship's writer and laundry steward employed by the Peninsular and Oriental Steam Navigation Company, the great passenger line known as the P&O, and he served aboard its liners, among them the vessel Morea, on the long routes out to the east and back. It was steady, semi-clerical employment with a uniform and a measure of standing, and it carried with it the particular condition that shaped the whole correspondence at the heart of the case. It took him away for months at a stretch, out of reach of everything but the post. Of his character, the record offers a consistent picture, drawn from those who knew him, and from his own conduct under examination. He was, by these accounts, confident, decisive to the point of impulsiveness, physically capable, and settled in his affections in a way that the young sometimes are and that the law does not know how to weigh. He had known the Graydon family for years. He had been at school with Edith's brothers. He was, in the beginning, a friend of the household. And it was in that character that he was present on the Isle of Wight holiday of 1921. And in that character that he was afterward, for a period, taken in as a lodger under the Thompsons' own roof. That arrangement did not last. The record establishes that Percy Thompson came to object to the young man's presence and to his manner toward Edith, that there was friction between the two men, and that Bywaters was required to leave the house. The available primary sources also record, and here the account must move with care, because the evidence is Edith's own later testimony and the recollections of others, rather than any independent proof, that the Thompsons' marriage contained episodes of unhappiness and at least one incident of violence, in which Percy struck his wife, an incident said to have been witnessed by the young lodger. What can be stated firmly is the shape of the triangle that now existed: a husband, a wife, and a younger man, the last of these frequently at sea and connected to the woman by an almost daily correspondence. The nature of the relationship between Edith Thompson and Frederick Bywaters, as it developed across the following year, is documented more fully than almost any comparable attachment of the period, precisely because so much of it was conducted on paper. He was away, she wrote. He kept what she wrote. She addressed him by pet names. She wrote to him of her feelings, of her frustrations, of her longing to be free of the life she was living, and, in a number of passages that would later be read aloud in a courtroom and that would, in the end, decide her fate, she wrote things that could be read, and that the prosecution would insist must be read, as references to doing away with her husband. She wrote of glass. She wrote of poison. She wrote of an unnamed something she wished the young man to send her. Whether those passages recorded acts or intentions, or the literary fantasies of a woman who read a great many sensational novels and cast herself as their heroine, is the question on which the entire case would turn, and it is a question the account will not pretend the surviving materials settle, because they do not. What is certain is only this: The words existed in her hand, and they were kept. Nothing in the crime itself was slow or elaborate. It occupied a few seconds on a suburban pavement, and the account will not dress it in more than it was. On the evening of the 3rd of October 1922, Percy and Edith Thompson went up to the West End of London to the theatre, as couples of their kind did on a special evening, travelling in by the railway that served their district. The record establishes that they attended a performance, recorded in most accounts as the comedy then playing at the Criterion Theatre, and that afterward they made their way home by the ordinary route, by train out to Ilford and then on foot from the station toward their own front door. The hour was late. It was near midnight, and by some accounts, the first minutes of the 4th of October had already passed. Edith Thompson was seen that night as she was habitually seen, a respectable married woman returning from an evening out on the arm of her husband, walking the familiar streets between the station and Kensington Gardens. She was not to reach her door in the manner she had set out to reach it. As the couple walked along Belgrave Road, in the darkness between the lamps, a man came at them. The account confines itself here to what the record establishes, that the assailant was Frederick Bywaters, that he had been waiting, that he came upon Percy Thompson and struck at him with a knife, that in the brief struggle that followed Percy Thompson was stabbed a number of times in the neck and about the body, and that Edith Thompson was heard to cry out. The words attributed to her by those who heard them, a repeated plea for the attack to stop, were entered in the record as they were recalled and belonged to it. The assailant fled into the dark. Percy Thompson fell and died at the scene before help could be of any use to him. He was 32 years of age. What the medical evidence would later establish about the manner of his death was straightforward and was never seriously contested. He died of the stab wounds and the loss of blood that followed them. There was no mystery in the cause of death of Percy Thompson. The mystery, such as it was, and the controversy, such as it would become, lay entirely in a different question. Not how the man on the pavement had died, which was plain, but whether the woman standing beside him in the dark had known, before that night, that he was going to. In the immediate aftermath, on the pavement and afterward at the police station, Edith Thompson gave an account that did not name the man who had done it. She spoke of a stranger, of an attack out of the darkness, and the police recorded her as distressed and, in the word used in some of the surviving statements, genuinely so. That first account did not hold, and it did not hold for a reason that had nothing to do with any weakness in it as a description of the attack. It did not hold because the identity of the attacker was about to be established by an entirely separate route, and because, once it was, everything Edith Thompson had written over the preceding year would be turned upon her. The two lines of inquiry that would converge upon Edith Thompson did not begin from her. They began from him. The man who had committed the act was not a stranger to the household he had struck at, and this was his undoing, and, in a longer sense, hers. When the police came to look into the circumstances of Percy Thompson's death, they were directed, by those who knew the family's affairs, toward the young man who had once lodged with the Thompsons, and who was known to have been attached to the dead man's wife. The record here names a lodger of the household, Mrs. Lester, among those whose knowledge helped turn the inquiry toward Frederick Bywaters. It was known that he was a seaman, it was known which line he served, and it was therefore possible to find him, and to find, when they searched, the place where a young seaman kept the things he valued. That place was his cabin. Officers searching aboard his ship, then lying in the Thames off Tilbury, recovered from among his belongings a large number of letters. The figure in the surviving accounts runs to some 60 and more, with a larger number said to have existed, every one of them written to him by Edith Thompson. The account has already described what those letters contained. It is enough to say here that the investigating officers, reading them, ceased to regard the woman who had written them as a bereaved widow and a witness, and began to regard her as something else. The two inquiries, the inquiry into the death of the man on the pavement and the inquiry into the mind of the woman revealed in the letters, now became one inquiry, and it ran in a single direction. Frederick Bywaters was arrested. The record establishes that he cooperated with the police to a degree unusual in a man in his position, and that his cooperation was of a particular kind. He led the officers to the weapon, which he had concealed after the act, and he stated, from the beginning and without wavering, that he had acted alone, that the responsibility was his and no one else's, and that Edith Thompson had known nothing of his intention. That was his account at his arrest. It would be his account through his trial. It would be his account, the surviving Home Office material records, on the last morning of his life. He never departed from it. Edith Thompson was also taken into custody. On the strength of the letters and of the inconsistencies between her first account of the night and what the correspondence suggested, she was charged jointly with Bywaters with the murder of her husband. The charge against her was not that she had wielded the knife. No one alleged that she had. The charge was that she had known, that she had incited, that the words in the letters were not fantasy but instruction, and that she was therefore as guilty of the death of Percy Thompson as the young man who had struck him down. From the moment that charge was framed, the case ceased to be a case about a stabbing in a suburban street and became a case about the contents of a woman's private correspondence, about what her words had meant and about what kind of woman had written them. The medical evidence in the case was given by men of standing, and it is on the medical evidence, more than on any other single body of testimony, that the later judgment of the case has come to rest, because of what it established, and, still more, because of what it did not. The examination of the body of Percy Thompson was conducted by Sir Bernard Spilsbury, senior pathologist to the Home Office, and the most celebrated medical witness of his generation, whose name by that date carried an authority in the criminal courts that was very great, and, some later came to think, too great. The post-mortem was performed upon the exhumed body on the 3rd of November, 1922, a month after the death, with the Ilford Divisional Police Surgeon present. The Home Office analyst, Dr. John Webster, also examined the case. The findings entered into the official record were clear. Spilsbury found the cuts and stabs about the neck and body that had caused death. He found the man to have been well nourished and, apart from a slightly enlarged heart, essentially healthy. And on the single question that the prosecution's case against Edith Thompson most needed answered in a particular way, he found nothing. This is the pivot of the entire matter, and it must be stated exactly. In her letters, Edith Thompson had written of feeding her husband ground glass concealed in his food and of administering poison to him. If those passages described real acts, there would be signs, scarring in the intestines from the glass, some trace or consequence of the poison. Spilsbury looked for them. He looked, on his own testimony, with care, precisely because he knew what the letters had alleged. He found no glass. He found no scarring consistent with glass. He found no poison, and no evidence that any had ever been administered. Dr. Webster's independent examination reached the same conclusion. On the physical evidence, the acts described in the letters had not happened. The woman who had written of poisoning her husband had not, so far as the body of that husband could reveal, ever poisoned him. The account will observe here, because the surviving record supports it and because it belongs to any honest telling, that the meaning of this finding was understood at the time by at least one of the men who gave it. It emerged in later years, on the authority of Spilsbury's own biographers and of a writer who knew him, that the pathologist privately regarded Edith Thompson as innocent of any attempt on her husband's life, that he read the letters as the physical evidence obliged him to read them, as the writing of a woman who talked of such things without doing them. That private view was not the view the court would take. The medical evidence established, as a matter of physical fact, that the poisoning and the glass had not occurred. The court would nonetheless permit the letters that described them to stand as proof of a murderous mind. The gap between those two things, between what the body showed and what the jury was invited to conclude, is the space in which the case has been argued over ever since. The trial of Edith Thompson and Frederick Bywaters opened at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, on the 6th of December 1922, before Mr. Justice Shearman, and it was conducted, from first to last, under the gaze of a public and a press whose interest in it was enormous. The court was crowded. The newspapers carried it at length. The case had everything that the popular appetite of the day was drawn to: a love affair, a killing in the dark, a respectable suburb, a bundle of secret letters, and the surviving accounts of the proceedings describe cues for the public gallery and a volume of coverage that few trials of the decade matched. The Crown was led by the Solicitor General Sir Thomas Inskip, assisted by Travers Humphreys, a barrister whose long career had already carried him through many of the great criminal trials of the age. Bywaters was defended by Cecil Whiteley. Edith Thompson was defended by Sir Henry Curtis Bennet, one of the foremost advocates at the criminal bar, a man of great experience and great ability, whose conduct of her defence, and whose later reflections upon it, form part of the record of the case. The evidence was laid before the jury in a definite order, and its structure is worth setting out, because the structure was itself an argument. First came the discovery, the killing on Belgrave Road, the witnesses to the attack, the flight of the assailant, the death of Percy Thompson. Second came the domestic history, the marriage, the arrival of the young man, the affair, the friction, the year of separation and correspondence. Third came the medical testimony already described, which established the cause of death and, on the question of glass and poison, established a negative. And fourth, threaded through all the rest and dominating the whole, came the letters, the correspondence recovered from the ship, read aloud, passage by selected passage, into the record and into the jury's hearing. It was the letters that convicted her. This must be said plainly, because it is the plain truth of the case, and because those who studied it afterward, including men who had no sympathy for adultery and no wish to excuse it, came to say the same. There was no evidence that Edith Thompson had struck any blow, and none was offered. There was no evidence, once the medical testimony had done its work, that she had ever poisoned or attempted to poison her husband. What there was her own voice on paper, ardent and reckless, and full of a longing to be free, and containing, among tens of thousands of words, a handful of passages that could be turned to the prosecution's purpose. The Crown read those passages and invited the jury to conclude from them that the woman who had written them had willed her husband's death and had set in motion the young man who accomplished it. The defence answered that the passages were the fantasies of a romantic and overwrought imagination, fed on sensational fiction, never meant and never acted upon, and pointed, in support, to the medical evidence, which showed that the very acts the letters boasted of had never taken place. Two things did the defence of Edith Thompson the greatest harm, and both are documented. The first was a decision she herself insisted upon against the direct and urgent advice of her counsel. Curtis Bennet advised her not to give evidence. His reasoning was sound, and he stated it plainly. The burden lay upon the Crown. The Crown could prove only that she had been present at the killing, and by entering the witness box she could only expose herself to cross-examination upon the letters. She rejected that advice. She was determined to speak, believing, it appears from what her counsel said afterward, that she could sway the jury and perhaps save the young man. She went into the box. Under cross-examination, she was pressed upon the meaning of the passages in her letters, and to more than one question about what she had meant by a particular phrase, she could answer only that she had no idea, an answer that satisfied no one, and that the record indicates told heavily against her. The second thing was the summing up. Mr. Justice Shearman was, by the account of those present and by the surviving transcript, a man of firm and conventional morality, and his direction to the jury dwelt at length and with evident disapproval upon the adultery at the heart of the case. He characterized the correspondence in terms of moral condemnation. The effect, whatever the strict propriety of the law, he stated, was to place before the jury not merely the question of whether Edith Thompson had conspired in a murder, but the far easier and far more damning spectacle of what kind of woman she had been, a wife who had betrayed her husband, who had written of him as she had, who had taken a lover 8 years her junior. Her own counsel would say afterward, in words that have been quoted ever since, that she was condemned for adultery and not for murder. The jury was absent for a little over 2 hours. On the 11th of December, 1922, it returned its verdict, and Frederick Bywaters and Edith Thompson were each found guilty of the willful murder of Percy Thompson. Bywaters, hearing it, protested aloud the innocence of the woman beside him, as he had protested it throughout. Edith Thompson, hearing it, cried out that she was not guilty. There was only one sentence the law allowed the judge to pass upon a conviction for murder, and he passed it upon them both, death by hanging. The interval between the sentence and its carrying out lasted a month, and it was not a quiet month, because in that month the country changed its mind. The appeals were heard first. Both prisoners appealed, and their appeals were heard before the Lord Chief Justice and 2 other judges on the 21st of December 1922, and both were dismissed. In law, the matter was now settled. What remained was the prerogative of mercy, the possibility that the Home Secretary might advise a reprieve, and it was to that possibility that public feeling, which had turned, now bent itself. The turn in public feeling is one of the most striking features of the whole case and is well documented. During the affair and the trial, the sympathies of the press and the public had run heavily against Edith Thompson. She was the adulteress, the writer of the letters, the woman who had brought a young man to the dock and her husband to the grave. But as the reality of the sentence settled, the reality that a woman was to be hanged, the first in Britain for 16 years, and hanged not for striking a blow, but for words in letters, while the medical evidence showed the acts those words described had never happened, the mood changed. A petition for reprieve was got up, and it gathered signatures on a scale that the record puts at approaching 1 million. Bywaters, from his own cell and under his own sentence of death, continued to insist that she was innocent and had known nothing. It was not enough. The decision lay with the Home Secretary, and the Home Secretary declined to interfere with the course of the law. The official notice, published in the days before the executions, recorded in the flat language of such notices that the Secretary of State, after careful consideration of all the circumstances, was unable to advise interference with the due course of the law in the cases of Frederick Edward Francis Bywaters and Edith Jessie Thompson, convicted of the murder of Percy Thompson. The date was fixed. The 2 of them would die on the same morning at the same hour in 2 prisons that stood less than a mile apart. The executions were carried out on the morning of the 9th of January 1923 at 9 o'clock, within the walls of the 2 prisons, and not in public. This was the settled practice of the period, and had been since the legislation of 1868 had ended public execution and moved it inside the prison walls, in the presence only of the officials the law required and permitted. Frederick Bywaters was hanged at Pentonville by the executioner William Willis. Edith Thompson was hanged at Holloway by the executioner John Ellis. He was among the most experienced men who had ever held the office. What happened at Holloway that morning marked him for the rest of his life, and it has marked the record of the case ever since. The account here will hold closely to what the surviving sources establish, and will name plainly where those sources disagree, because on this morning, more than any other in the case, the temptation to embroider is strongest and must be refused. The record establishes that in the days and hours before the execution, Edith Thompson's condition deteriorated badly, that she was in a state of collapse, that shortly before 9 o'clock she was administered a sedative by the prison authorities, and that she was by then barely conscious, incapable of standing or walking unaided. She did not go to the scaffold. She was carried to it by the warders and assistants, and held upon the trap while the executioner completed his work. Present, as the law required, were the officials of the sheriff and the prison and the chaplain. Outside the walls, in the rain, a crowd had gathered, and among them, the record notes, a woman carrying a placard against the taking of life. Of what followed the drop, the sources diverge, and the account will not choose among them beyond what can be supported. It is recorded by more than one witness, and in more than one later account, that there was a hemorrhage, that Edith Thompson bled heavily as she died, and that this gave rise, then and afterward, to a belief that she had been pregnant and had miscarried, or, in another explanation offered at the time, that some other physical cause was responsible. There was no post-mortem examination to settle the question, and so it was never settled, and it cannot be settled now. What can be recorded is that the belief that she had been carrying a child, if true, would have meant that she should never have been hanged at all, the law forbidding the execution of a pregnant woman, and that the question was left, as so much in this case was left, unresolved in the official record. The effect upon John Ellis was lasting and is documented. He was, by every account, deeply affected by the execution of Edith Thompson. He left the office of executioner not long afterward. In the years that followed, he attempted his own life, and some years after that he took it, and those who knew him connected his end, in part, to what he had been required to do on that January morning. The account records this not for its drama, but because it belongs to the record, that the carrying out of this particular sentence was of a kind that the man who carried it out could not afterward live easily beside. Descriptions of the demeanor of the condemned that come to us from prison officials are not, as a class, wholly reliable in their particulars, and should be received with that caution. But on the central facts of that morning, the collapse, the sedation, the carrying, the effect on those present, the sources are in agreement. Edith Thompson made no confession of guilt. There was nothing for her to confess, on her own consistent account and on that of the young man who died the same hour a mile away, and she went to her death maintaining, as he maintained, that she had not done what she was hanged for. Her body was buried, as the law then required, within the walls of the prison in which she had been executed, in an unmarked grave. With that burial, the legal proceedings in the case of Edith Thompson were formally at an end. The case did not end when the proceedings ended. It entered the historical record almost at once, and it has never left it, and the manner of its persistence is itself part of the story. The immediate afterlife of the case was in print. The trial was published within the year in the authoritative Notable British Trials series, edited by Filson Young, and that volume placed the full proceedings before anyone who wished to study them, and made the case a permanent object of examination rather than a passing sensation. it moved quickly, too, into fiction. Within 2 years, the novelist E.M. Delafield had drawn upon it for a novel of suburban entrapment. A decade later, F. Tennyson Jesse, who had studied the case closely, produced the work most enduringly associated with it, a novel that followed its shape faithfully and that has kept the case alive for readers who never opened a trial transcript. Later writers of detective fiction, working in the same years, returned to it again and again because it offered them what fiction rarely finds ready-made: a set of facts more improbable and more affecting than most invention. The scholarly and campaigning afterlife came later and ran in one direction. As the decades passed, the judgment of the case hardened against the verdict. A study published in the 1950s argued directly for Edith Thompson's innocence and took its title from that argument. In the 1980s, the writer Renee Weiss produced the fullest modern investigation of the case, returning to the documents, and became the leading advocate for the view that she had been the victim of a miscarriage of justice, convicted, as her own counsel had said at the time, for the sin of adultery under the form of a charge of murder. The consensus that has formed around the case in the years since is very largely of that kind, that the evidence of murder against Edith Thompson was, in law, weak from the outset, that the medical findings positively contradicted the acts her letters described, and that what carried her to the scaffold was not proof of a crime, but a jury's and a judge's revulsion at the woman the letters revealed. The case left institutional marks as well. It belongs to the long argument in Britain over capital punishment, and it is cited in that argument still as one of the executions that did most to trouble the public conscience and to prepare the ground for the eventual abolition of the death penalty. It left marks, too, on the mechanics of execution itself, in changes to the treatment of women condemned to hang that followed directly from what had happened at Holloway. And it left, in the sealing of certain of its official papers for 100 years, a small monument to its own difficulty, a set of records the state chose to close for a century, and which have only in very recent years come open. There is one thing more the record obliges this account to say, and it will be said once and plainly. In the century of retelling, in the novels, the studies, the arguments over her guilt, Edith Thompson has too often survived not as the particular woman she was, the clever girl good with figures, the manageress who out-earned her husband, the writer of 100 vivid and reckless letters, but as an occasion for other people's arguments, a figure in a debate about the death penalty or about the position of women, an example rather than a person, and there is a quiet injustice in that erasure that runs alongside the larger injustice of the rope. Something of that was set right, very late. In the November of 2018, after long effort, her remains were taken up from the common grave at Brookwood, to which they had been removed when Holloway was rebuilt, and were reburied in the City of London cemetery, in the same grave as her mother and her father, which is where her parents had always wished her to lie. Her name was set upon the stone. Her husband, Percy Thompson, lies in the same cemetery. The young man who killed him lies still within the walls of the prison where he was hanged. The case of Edith Thompson was the single matter examined in this account. The conviction was entered. The execution was carried out in 1923. The case became part of the national record. It has not left.